tell us a little bit about the book. What was the formative thought process that led to you deciding to put in the enormous effort to actually get pen to paper?
Absolutely. So, looking at our contemporary American political culture, lots of people perpetually complain about America's leaders, especially Congress. I mean, the approval rating in Congress is like 20%. It's totally in the gutter. And for all the complaining, if you look at, let's say, the business sector, there are a million self-help books, Jim Collins' Good to Great, Peter Thiel 0 to 1 on how to be the next Steve Jobs, how to build a unicorn company. And literally nothing comparable exists for statesmen, aspiring statesmen or current statesmen. So I just found it, a bit ironic. And I saw this void that if we're going to complain about our political leaders, shouldn't we actually have a bar, set the standard for the type of conduct that we want to see from them, and then actually create the institutions of learning that are necessary to raise and train them up. And so the Mirrors for Princes genre is essentially, these are self-help books for political leaders. They existed in every culture and civilization known to mankind, going all the way back to antiquity. I mean, China, India, Greece, Rome, all the way throughout Byzantium, the Middle Ages. And then they had a flowering in the Renaissance. And then the genre just totally disappeared in the modern era. And so
did that have something to do with the creation of the franchise?
Sorry, the franchise.
Like, did voting coming around as a concept lead to? Yeah,
I see what you're saying. I think so. Yes. Yeah. So I think there's really three reasons. The first is the shift from monarchies to representative forms of government. But I actually think it's easy, perhaps a little bit easier when you know who the young prince is, or you know who the king or queen's going to be, to write them a letter and hand deliver it and basically use it as a way to offer your services either as a tutor or a counselor. But there's no reason we couldn't do, reappropriate the genre for presidents or senators or governors today. And then I think there's really two other reasons.
Well, people are resentful though, right? Because that would imply that you know who those people are going to be 20 years ahead of time.
Sure. Well, that's true. So some of those, some of them were given as gifts to the young prince, right? When you knew who they were going to be. But many of these were also given to, it was at the coronation, right? They were given as gifts to kings and queens there. I think the two other factors at the beginning of the progressive era, there was a shift away from statesmanship, classically understood, in favor of management and expertise. There was, people became uncomfortable with the idea of, a great souled statesman, with his or her hand on the rudder of the ship of state, navigating it through tumultuous waters and unpredictable winds. And, people felt more comfortable with the scientific bureaucratic approach to statesmanship. And then I think the last thing is the contemporary university system just stopped teaching these classic texts, because they're guilty of what C.S. Lewis described as presentism. Basically, if it wasn't written in the last 10 minutes, then it's not really worth their time.
So why do you think that is, that the, let's just call it like the American people focus on that instead of like the West as a whole, started focusing more on like middle managers basically to lead the country as opposed to like great men?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Obviously, I think it was part and parcel of the wider, obviously the progressive movement had some origins in sort of the German university system and model. And I think that approach just favored kind of management expertise, a permanent bureaucracy. And so a lot of that was just imported. I think some of it also has to do with business culture in the United States. Some these businesses, kind of, if you think like coming out of the Gilded Age, were just such behemoths that, in order to run them, they had to be run more like, kingdoms, and massive bureaucratic organizations. And so people learned that bureaucratic approach in business. And I think it bled over into political life, too.
Do you think that with the, and you don't need to give away the book too much, people that listen to this show should buy it. But do you think that with the election of Trump that people are kind of moving away from that now? They're less interested in being under bureaucratic management?
Well, I think people have seen bureaucratic management for what it is. The veil has been lifted. And for a long time in American history, I actually think there was, a fairly strong amount of faith in, and even pride in, I think if you described it as bureaucracy, people probably wouldn't be proud of that, but I think generally if people, I'm not saying conservatives, but if you just have your average American is looking back at, like, let's say the New Deal, or baby boomers looking at LBJ's kind of legacy, the Great Society programs, I think there's a general sense of like, yeah, there were good intentions and like it made a difference. And this is sort of like part of the American fabric. But I think over time, the interests of the permanent class in Washington, D.C. really divorced itself from the interests of the American people. And, I think the election of Donald Trump was really sort of this a wake-up call to, basically, it was the American people kind of standing up and saying, we actually see this bureaucracy for what it is, and we're ready for a radical change.
So I want to come back to some of the contemporary political implications of this a little bit later. But before that, talking about why this kind of writing has gone away, would it be accurate to say that part of the reason is that the process of electing leaders became a substitute for the more classical qualifications of great rulers? Like, because you got elected, therefore you have everything you need to rule, became the shorthand, as opposed to in hereditary monarchies, like, you were going to rule and this was to make you a better one, one way or another.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's something, I think twofold, just basically about the election process. One of it is, so much of our whole American political system is actually focused on getting elected and not actually governing once you're elected. If you think of the whole kind of the whole pageantry around presidential elections, like, all the nostalgia, or even all the political reporters who kind of geek out on all this sort of old historic election kind of, horse trading, like, they're really telling stories about the campaign, the great political campaigns. And then that's where all the money is, right? And then once you get elected, then it's sort of the boring job of you've conquered. Sort of winning the election is kind of the ancient equivalent of being a conqueror, and then the ruling part, is the boring part. That it's sort of like, that doesn't really matter. Like, we've already kind of won the victory.
So in conservative circles in the United States, we talk a lot about Western civilization, and I have my issues with it because I think people substitute that for like good things equals Western civilization. But I remember months and months ago when we were first talking about this book that you were working on, you were particularly excited about some of the more like esoteric non-Western examples of great statesmanship. Tell us about some of those. I want to get a little bit more color on what else you found other than, the obvious stuff in Greece and Rome and Renaissance Europe and things like that. Yeah.
So I think the three, let's say four that I really liked. One was Han Fei's The Art of Persuasion. So Han Fei was an ancient Chinese legalist. He was really, I would say, a proto-Machiavelli. So he was a total realist in his outlook of the world.
What era would he have been around?
I should know this exactly.
Even what
I think it was like 10th
helpful.
or 11th century.
Got it.
BC.
Okay, so right around turn of the millennium.
And
BC. Okay,
yeah.
So
like going
3,000 years ago.
Yeah. And so he has the advice is brutal. I mean, he literally doesn't. He's totally amoral in how he's assessing politics. But there are even differences in how he approaches or recommend leaders approach management. So one example is he thinks the political ruler should not be a prominent public-facing figure, that the political ruler needs to be hiding himself constantly, and especially keep his desires hidden from his own ministers. So he advises the leader to never tell your closest ministers what you actually think. So you basically, bring them all into the room, you give them the problem you want them to solve, and then they come back and report to you, and you're totally impassible. You don't let on, and you hear all of the proposals. Because he says if you signal what you would like to hear, they're all going to tailor their advice to what they think you want to hear.
Interesting.
The other thing he says is if you're evaluating performance reviews in the ancient Han dynasty, basically he lets each minister pick like the target, their KPIs. You define your KPI. But what happens is when they come back and report on how they did, if they fall short of their KPIs, he punishes them. If they exceed their KPIs, he punishes them. Because he says, if you fall short, then you kind of just suck. You're not good. You're not good as you think you are. But if you exceed it, he's like, then you set the goal intentionally too low and you were unaware of your capabilities, or you're trying to trick me. So that's the kind of advice you'll encounter. But the selection I included really goes into the art of persuasion. It's really sort of a crash course in rhetoric and how do you win people over to your position. Shifting, making our way from east to west. There's an ancient Indian text written by Kautilya. And so this text really focuses a lot on two things. One is restraint. So the first one, a good ruler ought to have control of their passions, right? Not be given to gluttony, or to sort of any other kind of typical vices associated with the passions. Thought that was very fundamental for ruling. That's how the book starts out. But then it really focuses in on personnel and, how personnel, the whole success of your political operation depends on personnel, which dovetails very well.
Indians who care a lot about personnel. Why would you say such a thing?
Then as we kind of continue to work our way over, you get to a text in Byzantium that I like. So this was written in the 6th century AD. This was Agapetus the Deacon's letters to Justinian the Great. So these are essentially proverbial wisdom that was written to Emperor Justinian, and who was ultimately known for building the Hagia Sophia and then writing the Justinianic legal code. The Code of Justinian basically still shapes kind of European law to this day. And that advice actually is very anti-elite, which is interesting. So I think a lot of times when you think back, or when we contemporary Americans think back to these historic monarchies or, empires, we often think, okay, the king just sort of hangs out with the aristocrats. They go hunting. Like it's sort of this cabal against the people. That's not at all how Justinian approached it, or Agapetus. For him, it was that, there's this sort of unshakable bond between the common people and the emperor. And it's the emperor's job to actually be a scourge in the elite aristocratic classes and to be the one that really disciplines and checks them, and who actually rises above dueling aristocratic factions and sort of orders the whole polity, sort of embodies the people, not just represents them, but like literally embodies them and sort of brings them before, God and sort of more ultimate aims. And then the last one I'll mention is Al-Farabi's Aphorisms of a Statesman. So this is the Islamic text. He lived in Syria. I believe it was 7th, 8th century AD. And here it's interesting. Again, it's written in the form of proverbial wisdom, but his whole point is that, it's the physician or doctor who cures bodies. It's the statesman who cures souls. So there's a strong element of soulcraft. And he essentially unpacks what that looks like in Islamic context.
Did he imply in that any relationship or tension between the statesman taking on that responsibility versus organized faith? In his case, it would have been Islam taking on that responsibility. And across the board, what's the tension you've seen between how statesmen think of their role versus the faith in whatever society they find themselves in? Most overrated statesman that you've ever seen?
Cicero.
Really?
Cicero, yeah.
There are not many publications like the American Conservative that are taken very seriously. Why do you think that is?
I'm looking at your resume. Like, you seem like a good kid. You went to Hillsdale. You studied under Larry Arnn. You did the Trinity Forum thing. Now you have come to a magazine that was founded by, the most disreputable person on the face of the planet.
The great Satan.
Or the great Satan, Pat Buchanan. And you have totally ruined your career.
Dorks, tweed bros, cigars and Chesterton quotes. And
set aside the lofty ideas and just practically these are the steps you need to take to become a better